Welcome to the Messy City Podcast, where we talk with the people who design, plan, build, develop, or even just think about how to create beautiful, successful, and humane cities and towns. Let's learn from each other and create places we truly care about. Welcome back to the Messy City Podcast. This is Kevin Klinkenberg. I'm with my good longtime friend Joe Perry today, and I think I have to say right off the bat that probably my biggest challenge is going to be asking more than like two questions, because Joe has a unique ability to give really what's the diplomatic
verbose?
Well, I was going to say elaborate, detailed answers. Yeah. How about that? Like lots of detail,
Fair.
Lots of information. But Joe and I go back to college. We spent a little bit of time together in architecture school at University of Kansas. And he doesn't like to admit that he went to the University of Kansas to too many people. He's a Mizzou guy, but we still like him anyway. And then we had the chance to work together professionally a little bit. And we're going to talk about a number of things here, but I think one of the major sort of rabbit holes I want to go down with Joe is he's one of the few people I know who still actively works in both really small scale and really big scale development. So Joe, now, what's your actual title with the Port Authority?
I'm Vice President of Development.
Okay, so he directs a lot of real estate development for the Port Authority of Kansas City, which to anybody outside of Kansas City that may sound strange, but the Port Authority actually owns a lot of real estate, a lot of land, and they have been developing a lot of land by our riverfront for the last decade or so. But so that's the day job today. But Joe also has had a long time sort of side gig in buying houses and renovating them and selling them and investing in real estate just on his own. And then before the Port Authority gig, we had a great time working together on the new Longview project in Lee Summit, Missouri, which was the largest sort of traditional neighborhood development or new urbanist project in the Kansas City metro area. Where my old firm did a lot of the design work, and then Joe came on board to really direct a lot of the development, and especially building houses. So Joe's got an incredibly interesting and diverse background, and I thought it would just be good to kind of have a conversation on all those things. Joe, what did I leave out? A lot, I'm sure.
A lot, and just that you're one of my favorite people that I've gotten the pleasure to work with over time, from the time we were students to the time today.
Do you remember the name of our project in fifth year architecture studio, what that was?
Eco something.
It was SEED.
SEED, yeah.
Remember?
Yeah. Strategies for Economic and Ecologic Development. Yeah, and I just found my project the other day at 20th and Grand and was looking at it fondly.
This was like 1994.
Yes.
Right? Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Right. Correct.
Yeah. I know. That makes us sound old.
Well, I was 8 years older than you at the time. So
yeah, that's true.
Even more so.
The good thing is you'll always be 8 years older.
Yes.
Well, where do you want to start, Joe? I mean, I think it may be interesting. So you had this background going to architecture school, but you were what we called a non-trad student at the time, and you had a life before coming to architecture school. Why don't you talk a little bit about that? And then you also, like me, you grew up in a small town in central Missouri.
I grew up in a household where my mother had a interest in design, and we talked about things like why I grew up in a Usonian home. And, it was rare in a small town for somebody in 1961 to build a house with an architect instead of just like somebody built you a house, right? Off the shelf. So, that's the kind of influences I had. And at the time, I went to go to college at 18. I kind of thought it would be fun to be an architect, but I went to University of Missouri. There was no architecture program, studied civil engineering, and got a degree eventually in real estate
Hmm.
and money and banking out of the business school
Yeah.
instead. So when I met you, I had came out of school in 86 when you couldn't buy a job in real estate, worked
Mm.
for then half of the Royals ownership, Avron Fogelman, in building apartments. So that was my first job out of college, was working for a multifamily developer and seeing the good, bad, and ugly of that at the hardest economic time of my career
Hmm.
in post uh, the new tax law of 86. When you graduate from college in 87, there were no jobs in real estate. I was lucky to have a job out of school, but it's kind of funny today to have such a career that keeps touching multifamily, keeps touching land development. And it's just, I've been dumb lucky, as our old friend Dave Gale would say, just always in the right place at the right time to work on exciting projects over the decades.
Yeah. And for anybody's reference, we had Dave Gale on a previous
Yes.
podcast, had a really great conversation about his career in real estate, which has also been kind of a long and winding road.
Yeah.
I think that's actually, not to take too much of a tangent, but I think that's one of the fascinating things about this world of development and real estate. So it's different than architecture, right? In architecture, you go to school for architecture, you've got to have a professional degree, you've
Right.
got to get certified, you've got to go through a licensure process. It takes a long time. And you can practice architecture without a degree and everything, but it's very, very difficult. The professions have made it harder and harder. But in real estate and development, really anybody can do it.
That's right.
And
And a lot of people do, from a
right.
lot of different places.
Yeah. And so you get just an incredibly wide spectrum, of people, some really amazing, incredible people and some people, not so much.
Yeah. Kevin, I think the number one thing I see in people that can become a real estate developer, no matter what their academic background is the ability to see a risk before them and pull the trigger, not knowing how good of return you're going to get on taking that risk if you wait till you know all the answers. And that's why often engineers and accountants become the worst real estate developers,
Hmm.
and they have the best background to assess that risk. But because their academic background teaches them to cover 110 or 120% of risk. That's what they teach in accounting school. That's what they teach
Hmm.
you in engineering school. When you and I went to get a degree in architecture and urban design, they told us to take bold risk, right?
Mm-hmm.
So often architects have an easier way because their education tells them there's a reward to taking a
Yeah.
risk. Well, that's what real estate development takes, is to pull that trigger
Yeah.
before you know all the financial contingencies. Lots is uncovered. And that's why you see the people getting the highest returns are the people that take the risk earlier in that process.
Hmm.
And that's a hard lesson to learn for any of us, regardless of what our academic backgrounds. By the way, if you're an accountant or an engineer and you do learn how to take that risk, they have become, and we all know their names in Kansas City and other markets, they become some of the most successful developers we
Sure.
know.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. No doubt. No doubt. So I want to start with some of the smaller scale stuff. When did you first think about buying houses and renovating them and just doing that on your own?
Well, so in 86 and 87, when I had a good paying job at that time, I started becoming involved with people that were trying to solve for a lack of renovation loans for residences. There weren't a lot of the 401k loans and things like that allow someone today
Mm-hmm.
to buy something with 100% debt and then invest in it. Those loans didn't exist and they weren't
Hmm.
available to people. So I was able to buy property back then, $5, $10, $12,000, spend thousands in the four figures on them and sell them for $35,000 to $50,000 because people couldn't afford to buy appliances or re-roof, put carpet in, paint them,
Hmm.
work on the mechanical. deficiencies. So I was able to do that back then because there weren't loans. And then there were people, especially on the east side of Kansas City, that had people that could buy those, but there weren't owner education programs back then too. So we would literally sit in church basements teaching people who had 401ks at, I used the wrong HUD number or Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac number before, but you know what I'm talking about.
Mm-hmm.
The
Yeah.
renovation loans that
Right.
exist today, those didn't exist. But we had people that we would teach them how to borrow against their retirement savings at Hallmark or something. Someone that's worked there had a great career and didn't know they were able to buy a house. So we worked with unconventional buyers and unconventional projects in parts of the city that nobody else wanted to touch. And I found a few partners, and I just started doing it when I was in my 20s. And I've been doing it ever since.
Yeah. Yeah. So how did you find those houses?
Yeah. My second job was I worked for a mortgage company. And often the owners would say, hey, we don't want to take this mortgage out of this pool. We'd rather sell it to a loss to our employees or someone that you know. Would you go out and find buyers? And I just started being the buyer. So I was working for a mortgage company. And after my stint with the Fogelman companies, and it was just a ready-made source of, and then this is anywhere from 85th and Ward Parkway to 18th and Mercington. I mean, they were all over the city. And these were good homes that just needed to be loved again. And then I learned how to, if I lived in them, I could avoid capital gain taxes and started learning more tricks like a lot of people do.
Right.
And, it's just been a great source of a secondary income. It's always been my secondary income.
Right. And then over the years, like even fast forwarding to today, you're still doing this.
Yes.
You still enjoy buying houses and you move around. I notice you move around quite a bit.
Yes. And I think we're done. We're done. It's a bridge too far to ask my family to move one more time. If I told my partner we were going to move one more time, I would be told no.
But I mean, just to give a sense of things, like how many times, say in the last like 10 years have you moved?
We've lived in 8 properties in 12 years.
Yeah. Yeah. And you've done that partially because it's fun and you like it. I mean, that's a big part of it.
And the money is great.
And then, the advantage of if you buy a house with a conventional mortgage.
Yes.
And then you want to just talk a little bit about what the benefits, specific benefits
are? Of course, it's your primary home. So if you do have mortgage interest, you can write it off. Oftentimes, my mortgage interest is paid to friends and relatives who loan me money unconventionally and get a higher return than they would going to the bank. And I get a better interest rate than I would be going to the bank, especially on the construction side. It's an advantage to have people that see, that are willing to loan you money outside of that. I do often use nice regional banks. There's great banks in Kansas City that I use often to do these projects. But so I do that. And so one is cost of money. I keep it low. I always overpay on the buy, which is something they teach you not to do, but it gets me the properties that I know have big upside. And by taking the risk out of losing one I know is going to be a home run, I almost always overpay on the front end in order to secure a property that has huge upside. And the better the neighborhood, the more premium you're going to pay on the front end. That's counterintuitive to what they teach you in school, in business school, but it's served me well.
Yeah.
I know when I get into an area, no matter what happens to the economy, a good home in these neighborhoods will be marketable. Yeah. And so that's why I picked them. And then so on the going outside, I think a lot of people in commercial real estate understand 1031 exchange. I think what they don't understand is in the 1990s how Congress changed the rules in 1031 Section K, I think it is. B is one, K is the other one. I forgot which section's commercial and which one's for your personal home. But in the one that's for your personal home, all you have to do is live in that house 24 months out of the last 60, no matter what order those 24 months is. Chuck and I lived in a house that we lived in twice, and it was an Airbnb property in the Waldo neighborhood, and we lived in it during construction of properties twice in 6 years. And the clock was ticking on the 6 years. So we got to claim that exemption from capital gains when we sold it. And it was a home run on capital gains. It was a modest working man's home, very comfortable neighborhood. And while we fixed up houses in 2 other neighborhoods, we lived there.
Yeah.
And so that's the way. And I like your term that you first brought into my lexicon, house hacking. It's house hacking, right?
Yeah, totally. Yeah.
And it is learning how to use those tax advantages. And what else can you do highly leveraged in any kind of investment?
Yeah.
I just don't know of one where you don't pay capital gains. And there's a good reason why that's good for both local and federal government.
Right. Right.
To have people do what you and I do on house hacking like this.
Yeah. Well, and also on the front end, even if you go like a conventional bank loan route, you can buy it for 5% down.
Correct.
So much less cash out of pocket as opposed to an investor, which might be 25% down. Yeah.
And that's why I so often do non-conventional financing of these, Kevin, is just so that we can do lower down payment, or no down payment. I've done some of these where we lived in that are no down payment at all, because I borrow 100% of the money and I don't have to pay what we would call hard money loan, like a lot of people would have to by getting to investors who just are willing to loan money for 7 or 8%, where a construction loan today might be 10 to 12.
Yeah. So the Joe Perry strategy of if you don't mind moving every couple of years.
Yeah. You can take that exemption every other year, a quarter. So if you are in a situation where you're married or not, 2 people are in title, that means you have up to a $500,000 profit that you will never pay 1 cent of tax on.
Right.
$250,000 per person. You can be roommates, you can be married, you can be common law, you can just be friends.
Right. So, I mean, if you're not emotional about a house and don't feel like you have to stay there, that's a really cool way to go. Have you ever done that and then kept it as income property afterwards? Like bought it, kept it as income property, and rented it for a number of years?
That would be the smart thing to do if you look at some of the property that we've owned over the years. Yeah. However, I've looked at that what you give. So you get that leveraged appreciation. What I'm giving up by selling it within that 5-year, 2 advantages. One is no capital gains at all. And I just keep rolling it into a bigger house. Right. And so the second part of that is the best time to sell a house after it's been renovated is the first 2 years. The renovations are fresh, but especially your kitchens and bathrooms, the things that most people see as a project, when they get to 5 and especially 10 years old, no matter how well you did them, they're projects. People walk in and they see the dated materials. They see the dated trends are gone, and you lose that. So when I work with young people who want to build wealth in real estate, and I do that a lot, it started out with my older nephews and nieces' friends in the early 2000s, and then the new crop, the younger nieces and nephews' friends. And we always have this group of young professional people all over Kansas City that we tend to help do this. And we say, if you want to become a millionaire by the time you're 35 or 40 in real estate, the single way you can do that, the easiest, with no knowledge, is in your own personal home. That's where Warren Buffett is right. I am amused at the number of people that have attacked him in the last year for remaking that statement and saying that's wrong. That is not. I agree with one of the wealthiest men in the world that it is, because there are so many tax advantages to it.
Right.
But you got to sell that improvement while it has the highest value. And for me, it's 2 to 5 years. And after that, it starts to have a diminishing value.
Yeah, I can see that.
Right?
Yeah, kitchens and baths sell houses, and they start to look dated, not too long. I don't know if I've ever asked you this, but have you ever just done like a ground up new construction house for yourself?
No,
Yeah.
never.
So,
And we're
I
thinking
mean,
about doing it at a farm out in Leavenworth County, where you well know, you and your
yeah,
brother and I
yeah,
walked and talked out there over the winter, and had a nice lunch out there, where both my partner and your family have land grant
right.
histories going back a long
A
time.
long time.
And that would be the place where, if I ever do it, we'll probably be on that land out there as our second home.
So why haven't you ever just built a house ground
You
up?
know, we've just always looked at the opportunity. I own some lots after the last recession in Old Leawood too.
Mm,
One that I lived in, one that I never lived in, and the one of those two, we thought, well, here's what we could do with it as a value add pop up, if you will, in Leawood.
mm-hmm,
Take this
mm-hmm,
2-bedroom, 1-bath house and turn it into the 5-bedroom, 5-bath house.
mm-hmm.
And we looked at tearing it down, because we bought it at a very economic price during the recession. Um, at the end of the day, we ended up selling the property unimproved, right?
Mm-hmm.
But that was the closest I ever got, was potentially tearing down that house in North Old Leawood, and in one of the greatest redevelopment neighborhoods in Kansas City,
Yeah.
and ended up. And now today, by the way, that house was torn down 2 years ago, and a new house, multi-million-dollar house, put up
Huh.
just last year.
Well, it's just interesting because, as I mentioned, you had a day job for a number of years with Gale Communities,
Yeah.
where you did build new
Oh
homes,
gosh.
lots and lots of new
Hundreds.
homes.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah. So when you were doing that experience, and I'm just going to tell the story. I've told Joe the story too, but I just think it's kind of fun when we were working on house plans together.
Yeah.
And we were kind of all working designing these new homes. Often, we kind of come up with a first draft, and then Joe always took like the house plan, and he would draw like, is there a way to make a loop in the first floor of the house?
Yeah.
And he would explain to us that it's like for kids running in circles in the house. And we thought Joe was freaking insane for doing this. But,
Yeah.
now that I have kids, it's like, I totally get it.
I call it, does the house make the circle? And is it there's nothing wrong with a shotgun plan.
Right,
If you're living in
right.
an apartment, we've all done it. But at the same time, you take these bungalows, and the last 2 or 3 Chuck and I have done to live in ourselves have been big, big bungalows, right? And in all of them, there's sort of a mini circle that you can make.
Yeah.
To your point, if a kid can run around in a circle, so can the people that visit you for a cocktail party.
Yeah.
And then it makes there's no bottleneck. There's multiple ways around. New Year's Day this year, in a great big footprint bungalow near Luce Park, where we live today, we tested it for the first time. We had that many people where we could say, okay, does this house work? Does the flow work for entertaining? And when we knocked out walls in this 100-year-old, 99-year-old house, we made sure at the back we opened it up so we would do the circle. The front of the house is still, you walk in, you only have one place to go, left or forward, right? But once you get past that, now you can do the circle.
Yeah.
And it's important. It just really creates multiple ways, and people don't know why they like it better than the other bungalows of the same floor plan from the same era. They just know it is more comfortable and more open and more livable.
Yeah. Yeah. It's funny. Do you ever feel like, so I say this because we are now tearing up our second floor at our house and redoing it. So we're tearing up our kids' room because we found a way to kind of divide it up better and almost like they each get their own space. And we're tearing it up, and we found a whole bunch of space under the rafters that we didn't know existed. And we're like, we need to do our room too. It's like, do you ever feel like it's like a drug? It's like doing projects is like a drug.
I love finding space within the footprint of these houses.
Yeah.
And finding ways to recreate more space in the same square footage that you bought.
It's one of the coolest, most rewarding things when you figure out.
Talk about value add.
Yeah.
Like if you can take the house, and this is my phrase, and I use it with these young professionals that we work with all the time. If you are willing to take the house that no one wants in any kind of market and make it the house that everyone wants in any kind of market, you will make money. And that's what we do.
Yeah.
In good markets and bad.
Yeah. So let's shift. I want to talk about what you're doing today. Why don't you explain a little bit about
Yeah.
what you are doing, what you have done
Yeah.
in the last several years with the Port Authority, and kind of what's what's coming.
Well, I'd say, as working in land development with you and working with national leaders like I was able to do, working with you with David Gale and Lee Summit, and one of the best growing deals. The next chapter was going to be hard to beat because it was really needle pushing work that we
Mm-hmm.
worked on out there.
Yeah.
And we really kind of changed the way I think people look at development in Kansas City with a risk taker and
Mm-hmm.
Dave, right?
Right. Right.
And like that. And I thought, well, that was it, one and done. We'll never find another opportunity like that. And 2 years later, after we kind of wound down what we were doing there, I got a phone call with someone. It's like, you really need to talk to these people that are going to be working at Port KC. And while I worked with Dave, we had made a run at the Columbus Park land and the riverfront land, and we won. The city picked us. And it didn't work out like
Mm-hmm.
it hadn't worked out with a lot of other national developers before and since.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm like, okay, there's four things. There's uncertainty to the development market. That's why the riverfront hadn't happened. Let's get rid of the uncertainty. We did it.
Mm-hmm.
Sly James and Troy Schulte, as city manager and mayor and new mayor, said, okay, Michael and Joe will give you the keys to the riverfront against the internal city hall recommendations for
Mm-hmm.
good reasons. There was some good, healthy free air of why not to do it,
Mm-hmm.
right? They're giving up control. But my truth, Kevin, was the reason the riverfront didn't develop with Hines and Gale communities is the same as it didn't work for Forest City, didn't work for Hunt Midwest before all of us, was because there was no certainty in the process.
Yeah.
A great piece of ground that really deserved better than just being fallow. But it's really hard for a developer to go into a city and negotiate price and entitlements at the same time.
Yeah.
And so we could separate these things, and the Port Authority owns the land. The city still has a voice in what happens because they control the entitlements.
Right.
They control the density and the development standards and all of that. And again, for whatever reason, Sly James and Troy Schulte believed Michael. And Michael, had never been in that role. And look at him today.
Yeah.
In his career and what he's doing today, it's been incredible.
Right.
But as a young man, he did that one-on-one with those two. It wasn't me. I told him what I thought was important from my experience, but he sold it to them in a way that they could pull the trigger and give us control of it. And it worked.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just, and I get a lot of slings for a lack of vision and that it should have been better. I agree. But I'll be reflective on one thing, and then I'll stop and let you ask more questions.
No, that's fine.
And that is, go back, and I looked at other 85-acre parcels around the city, but specifically Crown Center and the Country Club Plaza, and looked at them as other pieces of similarly important pieces of ground in our city. And Crown Center is way different. Yeah. It's still not developed all the way today because they can afford to hold it forever because they're the Hall family and they're Hallmark, and they can do it the way they want on whatever timeline they want. And they have, and they should. Mm-hmm. But you look at J.C. Nichols, he built the plaza very quickly. Mm-hmm. Concrete block buildings, some of them. When I was a kid, there was a feed and seed store down there, for crying out loud.
Sure.
There were gas stations that had drive-throughs. There were tire stores in concrete block buildings. Now they're all gilded. Right. But my point is, J.C. Nichols started out and built something that was different, but at the same time, it incrementally changed to what it is today. It didn't start.
Oh, yeah.
So when we get strings and you're like, oh, you had a lack of vision, you shouldn't have allowed that first building to be a Texas wrap. You shouldn't have done this or that. But if you don't start somewhere and just believe that the next phase will be better. So our deed restriction down there of our covenants is simple. It says the next phase will be equal or better to the first one and the second one. So successive phases, that's it. Mm-hmm. That's the design criteria of higher value is, I think, with the words that we used. Mm-hmm. And it's a very simple concept, and it's subjective, right? On purpose. And we just hold ourselves to that standard. The next one that comes in, we're like, well, it has to be better. The deed restrictor says you have to be better or equal to the one that came before you.
Mm-hmm.
That's it.
So you've had some really high profile stuff, certainly locally, if not nationally, down there with especially the new stadium for the Kansas City Current, the only women's soccer stadium in the country. You've got the streetcar extension coming down there, but none of those came initially, and so Barkay was really the first
It
ground
was.
up development. Why don't you talk a little bit
Yeah.
about like how that came to be and what Barkay is for those who don't know?
God bless Labe Dodell and David Hensley. They had a 6-year conversation with us at the port. They desperately wanted to be on the riverfront before we wanted them to be on the riverfront. And we turned them away and we just said, it's not the right first project. And they kept coming back and they had worked with the city on a great piece of ground and they just couldn't clear some environmental and other problems with the land had. So when they came back almost 5 years later, I said, okay, look, hidden retail doesn't work, but we've got this land that's underneath of 2 viaducts.
Right.
It's 2.5 acres and it's got about a buildable acre between these 2 overhead viaducts, one's state, one's local. And if you can figure out how to be under there hidden, so we did proof of concept with them. We owned a warehouse in the West Bottoms that's now been torn down. It was 40,000 square feet. And we kind of agreed if they could get subscriptions to pay the land rent to us, and they proved that there was a demand for this thing that had never been done, a private dog park. Like we didn't see them as a good tenant because no one had ever done it before. And
Right.
I don't like to be first. As you know, you've heard me say over the years, I love being second, but first to market.
Yeah.
That's what the work we did with Gale
Sure.
Communities, right?
Yeah, no
You
doubt.
took what you did with clients all over the United States and
Right.
did it first in market in Kansas City.
Right.
Same way. I said, this is unproven. I'm a little nervous. So they started out selling beer out of buckets in a warehouse in the West Bottoms that hadn't been occupied in a decade. The Port Authority just happened to own it. And by the time they built the building and got it done, they had a debt coverage just by the subscriptions of the people that were coming to this crazy place you couldn't find in the West Bottom. I'm like, well, surely they'll find this place under the bridge down by downtown if they could find this building in the
Right.
West Bottoms off of Woods Weather Road, right? So that's how we got there. Great vision, a great concept.
Yeah.
And now they've taken it national and successfully sold it. And I couldn't be more proud to be a part of it. Those, they did a lot of things like you and I saw in New Longview. They spent way too much money on the first building,
Right.
and they corrected it on the second and the third. And good thing that they're all still standing to see the fourth and the fifth be planned.
Yeah. But in a certain way, it ends up being kind of serendipitous as the first project because it brought with this unique business that there was no place else like it in the entire metro area
in the United States.
Well, yeah, and
it had never been done.
And it's fun and interesting.
Yeah.
It brought a ton of people down to a location that normally people wouldn't go to.
And then we did this other extraordinary thing. The park department came to us and said, we got this group that has this league play for volleyball, and we didn't have a lot of activity on the riverfront. And we already knew that Flaherty was going to build the largest multifamily building ever built in one phase in metropolitan Kansas City on the riverfront. And like 410 units, Barkay's humming. And we built 6 sand volleyball courts because they said they needed 2. And we're like, we don't want to do 2, but we'll do 6.
Yeah.
And they've been full every season since.
Yeah.
They've been a great partner. Luke and Casey Crew have just been great. They brought a lot of activity and excitement to the riverfront before there was anything else down there.
Yeah.
And we proved that people wanted to be down there.
Yeah.
And then COVID happened and it blew the whole thing up. Barkay was the only place in town because it had 2.5 acres outdoors.
Right.
People could safely go there during COVID. And the same thing happened with the volleyball. You could still do it and be safe. So COVID was this serendipitous good thing for the riverfront
Interesting.
at a time when people were rediscovering the power of open places all over the metro. We had two of the go-to places for the whole metro.
So why don't you describe, just give some numbers about like the amount of development you've been able to achieve while you've been there, and then what is on the table?
Well, the secret sauce for us was we hired a guy named Ryan Adams out of Chicago who had worked on big stuff. And he was referred to me by two people that I respected in town. His wife had a job here with a big corporation, and Ryan was having to commute to Chicago every day, every week. And so we were able, at a time where jobs were scarce in real estate, to hire him because I liked him because he had a degree in architecture. He was financially savvy. He knew how to build a capital stack. He knew how to do it all. And I needed that with my experiences to go in with my land development, working with Dave and you and others in Lee Summit to have someone that really understood how to get stuff vertical. So when people walked in the door of the Port Authority, they believed that we understood what they needed to be successful. And because we had Ryan and we had innovative people like Michael Collins leading it, understanding the long game, we were able to build a bond program to help riverfront development that ended up being way more important to industrial development in the metropolitan area than it did for riverfront development. So our first projects were 4800 Main, the Board of Trade, to keep populous architects in Kansas City. It was, we used what we developed for the riverfront as a jobs deal for Kansas City. And then we did other projects like the Corrigan Station in downtown. And we were able, as an agency, to become the second local transportation authority for the petition of the circuit court to create the TDD for the streetcar. So all these things that the city needed, the city of Kansas City, Missouri, to build a bond program that had power of a port authority, it hadn't ever been done in Missouri before. And our predecessors had written a white paper exactly how Ohio, Minnesota, Washington State, California, New York, New Jersey did it with the same enabling legislation we have in Missouri. And all we did was implement a plan that was on the shelf and never been used. A lot of people would say we shouldn't have done it for whatever reasons. They just fundamentally disagree that we should be doing what we're doing. But when you look at now that because of that, Missouri can have data centers for right or wrong. If we didn't have a port authority in Missouri and a Department of Economic Development that supported us, there wouldn't be data centers to support AI growth in the Kansas City market if it wasn't for our tools. There wouldn't be a mega industrial project at I-29, 3,300 acres that's bringing giant jobs to Kansas City with Ace Hardware and others. Niagara Manufacturing. About 1 in 4 of our projects now in industrial development are going from spec warehousing to manufacturing. And that's another topic that I find extremely exciting that no one in Kansas City is talking about, is the jobs of the reshoring of manufacturing to the United States. And Kansas City is getting an outsized share of them. And I'll give you, because you know I nerd out on data. The whole nation as a country for 10 years in a row from 2011 to 2022 about did 80 billion in manufacturing construction as a nation, year after year after year, sometimes 78, sometimes 84, but it was basically 80 billion for a decade. You go to the Trump tariffs as a first pin, and the next year it went to 100 billion. Then you go to Biden leaving the Trump tariffs in place and passing the CHIPS Act. And that 80 billion went to, in the second year, 160, or it doubled. And this year, 2024 ended at 240 billion. It tripled in 3 years. No one is talking about it. The power of reshoring jobs in manufacturing in this country, and specifically looking at Kansas City getting an outside portion of those jobs, is one of the untold stories of our metro.
Hmm.
And we need to start looking at, is that good or bad?
Mm-hmm.
Or should we want to keep growing it? I think we should keep growing it. I think
Mm-hmm.
it's the future of our country. And obviously, the new president
Mm-hmm.
is going to double down potentially on tariffs. So,
Right.
with or without us think is a good idea. It's going to happen.
Right.
And how do we deal with it as a metro? And I'm not sure that there are a lot of good places to build industrial. It's not just Kansas City, Missouri. Kansas
Right.
City, Kansas is doing a good job.
Right.
Shawnee's doing a good job. Lenexa and Lee Summit and Liberty are all doing great jobs in industrial development. But that's why if I went to the Port Authority because of the riverfront development, and I did, it's why they gave me the job and it's why I took the job. I'm more excited in the rearview mirror about what we did in jobs production,
Interesting.
in office buildings and industrial development than the riverfront.
Hmm.
And it's weird to say because, 90% of the press has been the riverfront.
Yeah, no doubt. Yeah.
But the real economic impact and the billions of dollars of investment that we've bonded over is really in the other areas.
Interesting.
And the riverfront ends up being less than 10% of what we've accomplished.
That's amazing.
Yeah, it is.
It's
really, and no one knows it. That's why you're giving me a platform. I'm going to tell the story.
Well, I mean, I would never have guessed that was less than 10%. I would have, I know some of these others endeavors you've been involved in. There's the old Richards Gebauer airport.
Giant success.
But obviously you're right. They don't get the headlines. So,
but that was already in the play. The city of Kansas City had already laid the blueprint. Kansas City Southern had already invested in the intermodal freight gateway. And we had to work through. It was, talk about a calculated risk. When John Stevens came as CEO to Port KC, we had just put together the plan to buy out the options on that last 700 acres out there. And it was $2 million. And we only had probably $4 to $5 million in the bank. It was a big choice as an agency. And John saw it as an opportunity. And we did. We borrowed $2 million from a local regional bank and we bought out the options from the developer. And now today, as we're looking at, we've already cash flow, the bank loans paid off, and we've sold all but about 400 of the acres. And that's been the next generation. And now with the CPKC merger and their reinvestment in the International Freight Gateway, it's another exciting story that is just going to, I can't wait to see it in 20 years.
So, I mean, all this kind of makes me then want to get to like what I kind of teased you with when I asked you to come on, which was just thinking about comparing these two incredibly different worlds that you have inhabited and continue to inhabit. One world where you're redesigning closets and floor plans of old houses and then selling them, and this other world where you're building, mega factories, huge apartment complexes, new stadiums. I mean, what?
Yeah.
How does that exist in your brain? All that
it
together?
Exists in this way because as just an ADHD poster child, and that's who I am. I am that guy.
Yeah.
The energy and the endorphins that I get from working with my partner Chuck and going out and looking at these properties and doing it just the two of us, and it's small, and I get to put my energy, and sometimes even get my hands literally dirty doing it, and that is the yin and the yang of that other thing. That other thing, I could never have done it. I look at the crazy talent that we have attracted to Port KC in my 14-year tenure. And I talked about Ryan, and then we had Matt Prout, who runs J.E. Dunn Private Capital now for the Dunn family, was in that mix of people, and then people like Chase Johnson and Aaron Plump, and these just like crazy talented people that, like, without this team, I'm going to leave out a ton of people at the Port Authority. We have people in the legal side, some of the
Mm-hmm.
best legal people working in real estate development, the knowledge of Brian Ravenel, Mark Coulter, people like that inhabit those chairs, and now Megan Elder and other talented legal staff that we have. And then you get people like John Stevens, who
Mm-hmm.
was president of Cordish Midwest, for crying out loud. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, the team that we've been able to attract to do that work, I'm just a cog. Literally every day, I am not the reason we did it on any of it. I'm just it's that yin and yang of being a part of something big all day and going home on the evenings and weekends and just decompressing in a thing that's completely complementary to me in the way my
Mm-hmm.
brain works.
Yeah.
And I don't think I could be doing one without doing the other. And I mean that. I mean, I think that
Yeah.
people look at the two things and go, how could you keep it straight, or how could you want to do both?
Yeah.
Wouldn't you want to just, and I tell people all the time, when I retire from the Port Authority, I'm nearly 61 years old. And when I'm going to retire, I'm probably just going to do more of what Chuck and I do. And people are
Yeah.
like, well, you're kidding.
Right.
Or I'm going to go to a not-for-profit or some sort of economic development job where I can do for that community something that maybe
Mm-hmm.
they would have never done without someone with this diverse experience that I've
Right.
had.
Right.
That's my hope, and that I'll do it till I'm in my late 70s or early 80s, like my dad worked, and
Yeah.
just
Sure.
have the opportunity to do that.
Yeah.
I think I got one more of those in me, by the way.
Yeah. All
Like
right.
the thing I built with Dave
Sure.
and the thing I built with Michael and then John and our big team at the port. It's exciting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It is. And you're being overly modest. I mean, you obviously are incredibly good at executing and doing a great job and knowing how to put people together and
Yeah, but
everything
you know
else.
what?
So,
That's what you do, Kevin, too. I mean, you have that design brain, but you've also been an investor, and you've understood what the owner needs to pull
yeah.
the trigger, because you are the owner.
Mm-hmm.
And for the same reason, when I was at Gale Communities, I didn't hire anybody that hadn't built anything. At Port, I haven't hired anybody in the government sector that hasn't worked for private development before.
Yeah.
And
Right.
to have that person that understands both sides of those
Yeah,
things,
exactly.
that's the secret sauce.
Yeah. So I want to ask you just a little bit about small scale, like infill development while I got you,
Yeah.
because we talk a lot about that on the podcast. I've had a lot of people who do small scale development either as their full-time thing or a side gig, and especially ground up development. There's a ton of interest in that out in the world. Um, One of the things that I have told planners when I've had the chance to like give presentations to planners before, especially like
Yeah.
city planners working for city governments, is that I say this because I want your reaction to it. If you really want more of the so-called missing middle development, like we talk about, the historic duplexes,
Yeah.
fourplexes, sixplexes that make up so many neighborhoods that we love, it has to be as easy as house flipping.
Absolutely.
So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what you see, since you have this incredible diversity of experience, like barriers to overcome to get more of that kind of development, and then maybe just opportunities for people who see it.
Yeah. It's heartbreaking to watch good developers putting great investments down in places like you and Andrew and others are doing in Columbus Park,
Mm-hmm.
and seeing the bills be the same as if you were putting twice or triple the density on that
Yeah.
to you. So when we think about the public infrastructure side of the equation, it's been something I haven't been able to solve for in my own mind. And it's what's kept me from taking chances. I love it when I see people do what you're doing in Columbus Park. And it's the biggest risk takers in the investment. It's so much
Mm-hmm.
more certain to get to the return at things that are highly subsidized at
Mm-hmm.
the end of the day to do great density. They have
Right.
to be.
Right.
And we're willing to do that. And we're willing as a country, and it's not just Kansas City, it's across the country, we're willing to subsidize single family.
Mm-hmm.
We're not willing to figure out how to do the math on infill incremental development. So for the last couple of years, John and I and others at the Port Authority have been looking at how could the Port Authority bridge over that. We don't have all the answers, but in the next year we've got a few. We've worked with developers and told them the truth. It may be very difficult to get these over
Mm-hmm.
the hump, but we're going to try and see if we can work on our side that we think we control, which is a small piece of the problem, by the way,
Mm-hmm.
and just see if there's a way. We've done it a few times. We did this project on a few years ago with an out-of-town developer where there were horrendous condition. I don't know if it was 40 or 70 units. Christian Purvis in our office, another great person that we were lucky to have that came through and came in with great knowledge of finance and pre-development, post-development, and operating. Like we
Mm-hmm.
just never had someone like that walk in the door. But he and John worked on a project over on actually on the Paseo and about 20th, just near 18th and Vine. And someone came in and said, hey, we would love to reinvest. About a fourth of these units are unlivable, and we could just keep renting them and make money for what we paid, but we'd like to reinvest and keep rents low, naturally affordable for this neighborhood. And we did that. And I've told people over and over again, just bring us 10 of those a year where we can help you on the taxation side and you'll reinvest and you'll make these units still affordable, but livable for the next, you get to take a 50-year-old product like that that's unlivable.
Mm-hmm.
And even the 3/4 that were being lived in probably shouldn't have been. And they could make money as an investor by just keep doing what the person that owned it before, just,
Mm-hmm.
if I'm going to go ahead and say it, kind of be a slumlord, right?
Right.
And instead, they would have rather invested in it.
Right.
But there weren't incentives. There were disincentives to make them livable.
Mm-hmm.
Because now that they have to raise the taxes, they have to raise the rents incrementally, and no one benefits that. Not the school district, not the city, and certainly not the residents.
Mm-hmm.
But you know who, because I'm on the board of Save Inc., I look at that 12 or 15 units that were unlivable and uninhabited. And I'm like, we've got 1,000 families in Kansas City that need a place to sleep tonight.
Mm-hmm.
And they could probably get the public assistance to pay the modest rent that unit needed. I could get them a voucher. I just can't give it to them for a moldy, rat-infested apartment. So I'm really proud of that one. But what's really demoralizing is that no one brings us those to do. And
Mm-hmm.
we could fix that.
Hmm.
And I think we got to push ourselves in the next, I've been there for 14 years. We got to figure out a way to do that missing middle, to close that gap. And there's good people on all sides of this, Kevin. I get excited when I see the commonality of the intent of KC tenants being the same as the Home Builders Association. And no one would believe that on the surface. But when you get down to what their goals as organizations are, they have the same outcome. They want an economically sustainable place for people to live in Kansas City. And anyway, so I'm gonna stop there because I could talk forever on that topic. And I think that that's the end of my career. I want to help people find that commonality instead of what divides us.
Mm-hmm.
Where does KC tenants divide from people, multifamily developers?
Mm-hmm.
There's a disconnect. They often see each other as enemies, and they're trying to solve for the same thing. So that's my challenge for myself for the end of my career, is to help people see that commonality and maybe even help bring people together.
Do you think from a development standpoint, just from the standpoint of selfishly of the person who's doing the development, that the old saw that we hear a lot of is true, that it's just as easy to build 200 apartments as it is to build 6?
It is. And you know what I think will be the end of the day is when we finally get elected officials to understand that we need to stop getting what people do when they go to do infill development in places like Columbus Park or Midtown or in Brookside. I don't care, or north of the river at Vivian and North Oak, right?
Yeah.
I don't care where you are in the city. When you look at those opportunities and you say to people, well, we'll subsidize it when it's greenfield development, and we'll subsidize it when it's 400 new apartments going in on the riverfront, but we won't subsidize it when you've got deferred maintenance on an 85-year-old sewer. Right. So let me just give you this one. People all the time like to throw darts at the Kansas City streetcars. Oh, it costs the city hundreds of millions of dollars. No, it costs people hundreds of millions of dollars to renovate 85 plus year old wet and dry infrastructure under the street that was crumbling, that was going to need to be replaced anyway. As you know, when greenfield developers go out there, they build it the first time, they pay 100% of the cost, and they give it to the city. What no one ever does in the math that the missing middle needs the cities to do is to quantify the replacement of that 40 or 50-year-old or 85-year-old infrastructure and say, that's our responsibility as a city. And when someone comes in to do the sixplex, at the same density as the neighborhood it replaced, we're saying, nope, you got to pay 100%. You can't do it when you're renovating a sixplex or you're building a sixplex back on an empty lot. You can't afford it. But yet, we'll subsidize it for the person doing the new development in the greenfields, but we won't do it where someone else already invested and gave it to the city 85 years ago. That is the perversion of the economics. We have to recognize it and say it's not a giveaway. It isn't.
Yeah.
It's a reinvestment in a place we already have crumbling infrastructure that we already accepted the responsibility for just decades before.
Oh, yeah. I mean, it probably wouldn't shock you, but on our little project in Columbus Park, which is 20 units altogether, 10 for sale, 10 for rent, I think our original GC contract was $6.2 million. Nearly $1 million of that ended up being infrastructure related expenses.
Exactly. And it's a crime. Yeah. And here's why it's a crime. In private utility and in public utilities in the state of Missouri, like in any state, we have public service commissions that say it's okay for Evergy and Spire to reinvest in areas where the infrastructure is aged and out of date, and that all ratepayers should pay for it. But we won't do that at the Water Department of Kansas City, Missouri, or of Lenexa, or of any other place. We won't do it in the Public Works Department for the street in front of it. And it's because we're so worried about being, called a communist or a socialist that we can't say that's good business. That is capitalism. To figure out, like we did for Public Service Commission, to do it, if it makes sense then, and that's not communism and that's not socialism, that's capitalism at its best. So would be extending that to the water department of any city in metropolitan Kansas City or in the nation. But we haven't figured out the way to talk to people that aren't sitting in your shoes and my shoes, that are this close to development. But I think it's just math. As our good friend Audrey Navarro says about development, it's just math, right? And she's right about it. And I've heard her say that a lot in the last few years, as she and I have worked together so much on ULI issues. And she's such a good thinker. And so I'm stealing her phrase and I'm giving her credit for it.
Yeah. Well, it just seems that there's so much within the public infrastructure world where we have figured out really great ways to build stuff, but we've just never figured out really great ways to maintain and improve what we have.
Right.
And we have an incredible bias towards just building new infrastructure, period, and not really thinking about how to do the math to keep everything else that's older in good condition, and so that it isn't so expensive to do redevelopment.
So let's just go back to your example in Columbus Park. 100-year-old infrastructure, probably, right?
Yeah.
So your project is expected to pay for stuff that has been deferred for 50 years.
or more.
or more. And if you had not built your project and fixed that block long piece of infrastructure and that broke, guess who would have paid? The ratepayers of Kansas City. But because you were proactive and saw the opportunity and took land that was undervalued and you did it before it broke, now you have to pay for it and give it back to the city again. My point is, that is not a giveaway to you as a developer. That is, there should be some way to figure out a way that it's not 100% on the developer, because now you're deterring people instead of encouraging people to build on existing infrastructure instead of building on new.
Yeah.
We've got to get our head around it, and we got to do a better job of doing what you and I are doing here in this conversation and demystifying that it isn't a giveaway.
Right. I think, and one of my earlier podcasts, Mike Keene on from South Bend, Indiana. And I think he was the one who related to me that South Bend put a program in place several years ago that was for residential infill lots, that the city offered a straight credit of like $30,000 to redo the water sewer connections, to a residential property. Because, all of us know that you've probably done this a lot with your house renovations. How many times do you have to replace the water line or the sewer line?
1 in 4.
Yeah.
Right.
It's a lot. And then there are other times maybe you should replace it, but we don't.
Yeah. And I think insurance as a concept is another way to do that in these cases with urban redevelopment. Instead of asking a developer, because this is what I do to your specific question, how do I view it as an investor? The first thing I do when I buy a property is call the Service Line Company of America or whatever they are.
Yeah.
And I take out that insurance. Okay. So, and then when I go to sell that property, I tell the buyer, I said, look, here's what I did. I didn't replace the line proactively because it's still working. Why would I replace something that's still working, even though it's 80 years old? But here's what I do. I think it's good money to buy the insurance for $235 a year, so that if it does go bad, I don't get a $10,000 or $15,000 bill. And I think you should do it too.
Right.
So I know I didn't replace it because it works.
Right.
But I do take out the insurance. So instead of making Kevin Klinkenberg replace the sewer in front because it might break, why don't we say that the future owners of that need to pay to the city water department $250 a year, which is the cost of the insurance to replace that, or whatever that number is, in perpetuity, as a special assessment that goes into a replacements fund, because no one knows which one of those 85-year-old sewers is going to break this year.
Right.
But they're going to make you fix it regardless if it's broken. Why?
Yeah.
When we could just collect the money in the way I just said. That's really what the Public Service Commission does for repairs and replacements of the grid, right? Inspire does it too. And it's legal because they have a responsible financial model built over decades to say this is what it costs if you wait for them to fail, or you wait for them to show signs of that this one's going to fail next.
Right.
And that's what they do. And I think we need to extend it again to what you and I refer that to the dry infrastructure.
Right.
They figured it out on the dry infrastructure. We need to figure it out on the wet infrastructure and the roadside.
Yeah. Yeah. Joe, I'm afraid we could go all day.
Oh, we could. We'll do it again.
But yeah, I probably should draw it to a close for today. Any parting words you want to share, or words of advice, especially to younger people who might listen and think about how, hear what you're talking about, get excited, think about doing something?
I think the same thing that people taught you and I when we were in architecture school, when you were 22 and I was 30. Smart people told us when we went to that 5th-year studio done by Glenn Leroy, and Glenn brought in real practitioners. And time again, I heard the same thing I heard from Dr. David West guest lectures at the University of Missouri when I was getting my real estate degree. People would come in from Kansas City and St. Louis, like people would come into Glenn's studio, and they would say to us, when people say no, ask them, yes, and. yes, you should solve for that thing that's making you say no. And I still want to do the project. So how can we solve your problem? And just having a yes and I see young professionals. You were one of the few in our architectural class that weren't 8 or 12 or 15 years older, like some of us were, that would do the critical thinking. Richard Wetzel was another person in our class that at that time, you all were extraordinary in that you were younger than some of us, and yet you could see that there was another way to skin the cat, to do things differently and not just accept the no, right? So sometimes I hear young people go, oh, they're old, they don't get it. Instead of saying, no, they have life experiences that makes them a little jaded about saying yes to this. And therefore, how can we work with these people who have knowledge and actual experience? And that's my kind of frustration point. The older I get is the more I see youth and inexperience as I know better and you don't have any vision. No, I have experience that says you better find a way to make people happy that could stand in your way and not just hit your head against a block wall and never get to a project that you can pull the trigger on. So I see so many talented people that you and I went to school with, some of the most talented designers, never really built anything.
Yeah.
Because they could never pull the trigger until they had the perfect project. No project is perfect. Know that in 50 years, half of those things we built are going to get replaced by something else. And I hate that from the embodied energy standpoint. But at the other end of that, it gives you permission to test and try.
Yeah.
And so I would just say, just don't say everything that isn't. I'm going to throw on one more. I get fatigued at young people who are like, oh, that's just, corporate crap architecture. No, it's not. It's marketable architecture. And when you go to try to get the bank loan, you're going to find out why you would accept what people accept in order to get things done and build buildings and do things. I think you should try for things that are exciting, that create great public spaces, and look at the residual and impact of your project. I'm not saying just accept anything and do it as fast as you can. I'm just saying maybe be a little less critical till you've done one.
Yeah.
And maybe be a little less critical until you've had to sit in that seat and explain why you're going to double or triple the cost of the physical envelope because people at AD Magazine say that's what it should be this month.
Right.
So, it's just, I think I'd like to see the temperature brought down a little bit on some of these things and celebrate that we're moving as a city instead of just everything's just not quite good enough.
Yeah. Yeah.
They would help us as a metro.
Yeah. All right. Fair enough. I like that.
That was a little bit of a ramble.
That's all right. No, that's really good. I appreciate it. All right. Joe Perry, if anybody wants to get a hold of you, what do you suggest? What's the best way?
I am a prolific LinkedIn guy. That is my easiest way to get my attention. And that's such an old man answer to a social media question. But that's the easiest way to capture me.
If the cardigan fits.
Yeah.
So be it.
Yeah. He's laughing because I'm wearing a 20-year-old cardigan. I truly am wearing a 20-year-old cardigan.
That's all right.
All right.
Thanks, Joe. I really appreciate it.
That was fun.
All right. Talk to you later.